Jonathan Hetterly here, and today I'm going to be doing a psychological analysis of the documentary on Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. But before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe to our channel and click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out when we drop new content that explores the intersection of pop culture and psychology. So today I'm going to talk about the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor? It is not a show that I personally watched while growing up, but clearly millions of people not only watched it, but were deeply moved and affected by having Mr. Rogers be a part of their life. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the influence of the show and what we know about early childhood development and even emotional expression with young people. I think from the intro itself, Mr. Rogers is really welcoming himself into people's lives, and people are welcoming him into their homes. And you see this simply by a small gesture of him taking off of his blazer jacket and putting on a sweater. But what he really was demonstrating was a man really being available and emotionally available to children. If we think back to the 60s and the 70s, really kind of the peak time of his show, we were in a phase in American culture where it was really not a significant role in their life to be available or emotionally available to their kids. In fact, we know that for a lot of people, traditionally, the role of the husband or the father was to be the primary provider. But sometimes that translated into coming home and really relaxing from a hard day's work and not necessarily engaging or putting themselves in the midst of their children's lives and the comings and goings. Well, Mr. Rogers sort of saw that there was a deficit there, that men were not being a part of kids' lives, and men were not helping model and train young children to express their emotions and to turn to fathers as a source of emotional comfort and stability. Because really, first and foremost, what Mr. Rogers provided was a secure and safe attachment. When we think about young kids, young children, newborns, they don't have to learn to be afraid, they have to learn to feel secure. And that's really what Mr. Rogers provided as a kind neighbor. Was he tackled a lot of sensitive and upsetting topics, but in a way that kids would not be upset by them, but they'd feel a little bit safer. They would have a little bit better understanding about it rather than what we sometimes see with parents or adults, which they kind of gloss over things with kids. Or they dismiss it as you're too young. When you're older, when you grow up, you'll understand it. That's really when we'll talk to you about it. And Mr. Rogers really didn't subscribe to that. He subscribed to children have deep emotions and feelings, and when there's deep emotions without understanding or knowledge to attach it to, that can really amplify a kid's fear and worry and confusion. And so he really challenged our culture to talk to kids at their level, help them understand what's going on in their lives and the things that don't make sense. Break through that barrier where kids have all these questions and there's all these things they don't know about, but guess what? No adult is talking to them about it. No adult is really helping them understand. So in Won't You Be My Neighbor, you see Mr. Rogers use his show to tackle such sensitive topics like race relations, divorce, the Vietnam conflict, even assassination. Topics that parents oftentimes would feel like those are too upsetting or too complex to try to talk to a kid about. And yet, kids don't live in a vacuum. So they hear or they know that something's going on in their lives, but there's no adult to really help guide them through understanding both what's going on and to help them understand the feelings that they had. Another thing that Mr. Rogers and the documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor kind of reminds us of is a time in our culture where kids were actually probably more neglected than they are in our current times. And now I'm not saying that today's times are automatically better. In fact, an argument could be made that maybe our culture has swung to where we're overly preoccupied by young people. But when Mr. Rogers came on the scene, and even when public television was making waves early on, it was because there was a gap and a need for people to be a part of kids' lives, because both with the Vietnam conflict and even just sort of the turmoil in our country, as well as some of the older traditions of gender roles in the family life, is that kids probably were not getting a lot of attention. And so Mr. Rogers really made an effort we need to be a part of these kids' lives. These kids are yearning for connection, and not just connection with other children, but with adults, with parents. And so again, we sort of see in our culture, we swing back and forth usually between times when kids and children are being neglected and they're not really being given adequate time. And then we swing at other times in our culture where we're over preoccupied with kids and they become the center of the family life and they become the most important person.
Turn around. That way. Ow!
In fact, we're probably living at a time now where children are focused on too much and they've become the center of the family life, and a lot of decisions for the entire family are being made based upon a kid's priorities and their decisions and their responsibilities and the pressure for them to launch and succeed. But that hasn't always been the case. And so Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood really kind of introduced a way for young kids to feel like they were a part of the family and they were a part of somebody's life, and that they weren't just little kids that sort of needed to be pushed aside. One of the things the documentary really explores is Mr. Rogers' personal values and belief about television as a medium to reach young kids. And he really pushed back against television purely as an entertainment platform. It's kind of interesting, you get to see maybe how passive-aggressive or just outright critical he was of television that was purely entertainment and bombast without a lot of message beneath it for kids to kind of learn values and character. And that's really what he saw television, and specifically his show, as accomplishing. It was a platform for kids to maybe be entertained, because most of the time kids and people go to television as a form of entertainment and escapism, but he saw it as a platform to teach them life skills, to teach them values, to teach them character traits that didn't need to be washed away or lost in a sea of explosions or a sea of violence, or kind of shows that exhibited a lot of behaviors that he thought were really counter to what kids needed at that time. And that maybe in some ways could talk a little bit about some of the challenges we maybe have with not only today's content for young people, but just even the tone of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Because one of the things I was really struck by while watching the documentary, and one of the things that impressed me even when I was growing up, and it may be one of the reasons I never actually watched the show or got into it, was it is a very, what you might call, slower pace type of show. It's very simple. In fact, each episode a lot of times would tackle one topic. And that really didn't register with me as a young kid. I was probably just an excess ball of energy. But I could see how some people, in the midst of, if they had really troubling childhoods, or that it was really relieving to be able to kind of calm down and focus on one thing, how the show would really be almost an exercise of mindfulness and focus. And that really runs counter to today's culture and even our entertainment, which is super fast paced. A lot of cuts and edits, a lot of sound, a lot of moving parts, to where I would never accuse Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood of being overly stimulating to the senses. But that's actually something that we worry about with today's kids, is the advent of technology and social media in their hands. Are we giving them too much entertainment? Are we giving them too much content to where their brains can't process it, and certainly makes it more difficult for them to walk away from a show with some type of takeaway in terms of their values and character and things of that nature? Finally, I want to talk about the documentary and Mr. Rogers' show when it comes to positive psychology and emotional intelligence. Because again, if you think about some of the topics that he addressed on his show, or even if you think about the tumultuous time our culture was facing in the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam conflict, with the civil rights movement and all the turmoil that came with politics. There would be a lot for Mr. Rogers or any show to be very critical and dismissive, maybe even pessimistic about our culture. And yet he viewed his show as a beacon of hope, a beacon of optimism, and a beacon of kindness. Something that maybe should resonate more and more in today's time, where we can be very prone to absorbing the tone and temperature of our current climate in American culture, where there's just hyperbole and divisiveness and black or white thinking and very critical and demonizing people that have different views or beliefs than one another. And that's really not what Mr. Rogers stood for. He stood for love and kindness and the dignity of every person, even a young person. And that really is at the heart of not just positive psychology, of looking at what's meaningful and what's worthwhile and purposeful, not only in life but in people, but that's also in terms of emotional intelligence, the ability to read what's going on in a person or in the culture and what they will respond to. Because in a lot of ways, Mr. Rogers was and continues to be counterculture. There's really not another show that's ever been like Mr. Rogers when you think about the time that it was present or it was on the air. And the documentary really highlights that by showing the contrast between other television shows for kids that were going on when he first aired in the 60s, the 70s, and even the 80s. And then you see kind of how much his show didn't fit the mold. And yet he knew that there was an audience. He knew that there was a need for that. And that really is high emotional intelligence, not just with Mr. Rogers, but it really is his belief that young people would connect to somebody, an elderly man, a middle-aged man, just looking into the camera and saying things like he was talking straight to that child in that home around the United States. And that really is the beauty of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and the beauty of the documentary is that it helps us more and more get to know the man behind the show. And for a lot of people growing up, they felt like they already knew him, and this is a chance for them to get to know a little bit more about the man after the cameras stopped rolling. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. What'd you think about the documentary? Be sure to leave me a comment below. Is there anything else that maybe I missed in my summary of the documentary? You can also leave me a recommendation of a film that you would like for me to discuss here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to follow me on Twitter and check out shrinktank.com, where we post articles, videos, podcasts, and more, everything exploring the intersection of pop culture and psychology. Thanks again for watching Psych Cinema. We'll see you next time.
You always make each day such a special day. You know how? By just your being you. Only one person in this whole world like you. That's you yourself. I'll be back next time. Bye-bye.